The lecture hall was packed. Students filled every seat, notebooks open, laptops glowing, whispers buzzing through the room. At the front of the class, the professor stood tall, his posture confident, his voice sharp. He was known for his bold opinions and his brutal honesty. Today's topic? Faith, belief, and why, according to him, they were nothing but illusions. Then the door swung open. Tyreek Hill walked in. The professor smirked. "Ah, a football player. You believe in fairy tales too?" Laughter filled the hall. But what nobody knew was that by the end of this class, Tyreek's response would change everything. Tyreek Hill took a seat in the middle of the lecture hall, calm and collected. He was not there to debate, not there to prove anything. He had simply come to listen. A friend had invited him to the class, saying it would be an interesting discussion. But the professor, he had different plans. With a smug grin, he turned toward Tyreek, addressing him in front of everyone. His voice carried a hint of amusement, mixed with condescension. "You are an athlete, right?" he asked, tilting his head. "Built strong, fast, talented." He paused, his smirk widening. "But tell me, when was the last time you used your brain instead of your legs?" A wave of laughter rippled through the students. Some covered their mouths, others chuckled openly. A few glanced at Tyreek, curious to see how he would react. But Tyreek, he did not flinch. He simply met the professor's gaze, unshaken. The professor continued, leaning into his moment. "Let me guess, you pray before every game? Ask some invisible force to help you win?" He scoffed. "Tell me, when you drop a pass, does that mean your God just does not care?" The room grew quieter. Some students shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in tone. What had started as a joke at Tyreek's expense was beginning to feel like something more. The professor folded his arms, confident that he had made his point. "Faith," he continued, "is a coping mechanism. People use it because they are afraid of the truth. There is no higher power watching over us. There is just logic and reality." He let his words settle, waiting for Tyreek to react. But instead of arguing, instead of defending himself, Tyreek did something nobody expected. He took a slow, deep breath. Then he stood up. The laughter stopped. The murmurs faded. The energy in the room changed. And in that moment, everyone knew something unforgettable was about to happen. The lecture hall, once filled with laughter and whispers, was now dead silent. Tyreek Hill slowly walked toward the front of the room. His steps were steady. His expression? Unshaken. He turned to face the professor, then glanced at the students who had been laughing just moments ago. His voice was calm, controlled. "Professor," he said, his tone even, "let me ask you something." The professor smirked, arms still crossed. "Oh? A philosophical debate? All right, go ahead." Tyreek nodded. "Do you believe in love?" The question caught the professor off guard. His smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered. "Of course," he said with a chuckle. "Love is an emotion. It can be measured. We can observe how people behave when they are in love. Scientifically, love is a reaction in the brain, a mix of hormones and neurotransmitters." Tyreek took a step closer. The room was so quiet, you could hear every breath. "Okay," Tyreek said. "But have you ever seen it?" The professor frowned slightly. "What?" "Love itself," Tyreek clarified. "Not the actions, not the proof, just love. Have you ever seen it with your own eyes?" The professor hesitated. Students shifted in their seats, waiting. The confidence in the professor's face was still there. But now, there was doubt creeping in. Tyreek continued, his voice steady. "You say faith is an illusion because we cannot see it, because we cannot hold it in our hands. But we believe in things we cannot see every day. Love, hope, loyalty, purpose." The professor opened his mouth, then shut it again. Tyreek turned to the class. His words carried weight now, deeper than football, deeper than religion. I have seen things you would not believe. I have seen teammates stand together after heartbreaking losses. I have seen families hold each other after tragedy. I have seen kids fighting impossible battles with nothing but faith keeping them strong. The energy in the room shifted. The students who had laughed earlier now sat still, their faces thoughtful, some even uncomfortable. Then, Tyreek's voice dropped lower. You can laugh at me. You can say I am wrong. But faith, it is not weakness. It is strength. The professor said nothing. For the first time in the entire class, he had no comeback. The professor leaned back slightly, his usual smirk replaced by something else, uncertainty. For the first time, he did not have a quick response. No sharp retort, no sarcastic remark, just silence. Tyreek let the moment sit, then turned to the class. You all laughed earlier, he said, his voice even, because it is easy to laugh at something you do not understand. The students who had chuckled before now avoided his gaze. The shift in the room was undeniable. The mood had changed. Tyreek continued, his words slow, deliberate. You say faith is not real because you cannot see it. But tell me, how many of you have been through something that should have broken you? Something that hurt you so bad, you thought you would never get past it? The entire room stayed still. A few students nodded slightly, almost unconsciously. Tyreek's voice softened. When I was a kid, I had nothing. No guarantees, no certainty, just a dream. And people told me over and over that I would not make it, that I was too small, that I was not good enough. But every time I wanted to quit, every time it felt impossible, something inside me told me to keep going. The professor exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. He knew what was happening. Tyreek was not just making a point. He was winning over the room. You can call it determination. You can call it instinct. I call it faith, Tyreek continued, because I could not see where my path would take me. I could not hold my future in my hands. But I believed in it anyway. The professor crossed his arms, but his confidence was slipping. Tyreek locked eyes with him. You might think you have all the answers, he said. And maybe you do. But for the people out there holding on to faith, fighting through pain, chasing something bigger than themselves, I would never take that away from them. The professor looked down for a second. His usual arrogance had faded. A single question had flipped the entire lecture upside down. And what happened next left the entire class stunned. The room felt different now. The energy, once filled with mockery and laughter, had turned into something heavier, something real. Tyreek Hill stood tall, his words still hanging in the air. The professor, once so sure of himself, sat still, processing everything. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke up. I needed to hear that today. Every head turned. A young woman sitting near the last row wiped her eyes. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. My mom passed away last year, she continued, and the only thing that got me through it was faith. People told me I was just imagining things when I said I still felt her presence, but I knew she was still with me. The room was dead silent. The professor glanced at her, then at Tyreek. Another student, a young man in a hoodie, shifted in his seat. He had been one of the people laughing earlier, but now? His expression was different. I get what you are saying, he admitted. I grew up with nothing too. Some nights I did not even know if I would have food. The only thing that kept me going was believing that it would get better. He sighed. If I did not have that, I do not know where I would be right now. Tyreek nodded, his face calm, understanding. Slowly, more students started nodding. The professor exhaled, rubbing his temple. I suppose I never thought about it like that. His voice was quieter now, less certain. Tyreek did not gloat. He did not smirk or rub it in. He simply gave a small smile. Not everything has to be proven to be real, he said. Sometimes we just know. A few students clapped softly. Then, more. The professor looked around, his usual confidence completely gone. He had walked into this class thinking he had all the answers, but now, Tyreek Hill had just taught him a lesson he would never forget. The professor sat back in his chair, his arms no longer crossed, his smirk completely gone. For the first time in a long time, he had no response. The students, who had once laughed at Tyreek Hill, now sat in thoughtful silence. Some stared down at their desks, others looked at Tyreek with a newfound respect. Then, something happened that nobody expected. The professor extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than before. That was a different way of looking at things. Tyreek shook his hand. No arrogance, no pride, just quiet respect. One by one, students started clapping. It started slow, a few hesitant claps, unsure of whether this moment called for applause. But then, it grew. The students who had laughed at Tyreek earlier, now they were the ones clapping the loudest. A few even stood up. This was not just about winning an argument. This was about changing perspectives. Tyreek did not argue. He did not attack. He simply showed them a truth they had never considered before. The professor leaned forward, exhaling deeply. "You know, I have taught this lecture for years," he admitted, "but I have never had a student, or a guest, challenge me like that." Tyreek smiled slightly. "I was not trying to challenge you," he said. "I was just trying to show you what faith really is." The professor nodded slowly. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but nobody moved. For a moment, they all just sat there, absorbing what had just happened. Tyreek turned and walked toward the door, but before he left, one last student called out, "Hey, Tyreek." He turned back. The young man who had spoken earlier, the one who had admitted his own struggles, met his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "For real." Tyreek gave him a nod, then pushed open the door and walked out. What had started as a moment of humiliation had turned into something far greater, and in that classroom, a lesson was learned that no textbook could ever teach. Strength is not just about speed or power. It is about standing firm in what you believe, even when others try to tear it down. Tyreek Hill could have argued. He could have fought back with anger, but instead, he chose wisdom. He turned humiliation into a lesson and left the entire room speechless. What do you think? Did Tyreek handle this the right way, or should he have responded differently? Let us know in the comments. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more unbelievable NFL stories. Stay tuned for the next shocking and inspiring tale from the world of football.